You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is Saturday morning, April 12th. Happy Masters weekend to those who celebrate. Indiana, we got a lot going on here in terms of weather. If you've been around the state over the course of the last couple of weeks, we've had storms. We had a freeze warning last night. It's April in Indiana. And one day you walk out and you're like, wow, it's spring. This is delightful. And the next day you walk out, it's like, well, winter's back again. So if you've lived in this state for any period of time, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Short show today. Not a huge number of updates. We'll talk some IU football. We'll talk some IU basketball. We'll talk some college sports stuff in general. But let's just go ahead and dive into it. First, just a reminder, we're brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. And Homefield, of course, with some championship swag if you want to celebrate the UConn women winning their most recent national title or Florida winning theirs. They've got brand new apparel at Homefield Apparel that you can purchase. Head over to the website, homefieldapparel.com. Use the code HOME23. Get 15% off your first order. If you haven't, go look at the Indiana box. These Homefield boxes that they have put out. Really, really exciting collections of apparel. The Indiana box with an 83 Big Ten Champs shirt that looks really nice, an 87 National Champs shirt, a hoodie. It's a nice curated collection of apparel. They've got those for several different schools, but they've got one for Indiana. So again, HOME23, the code, get 15% off your first order. Head over to homefieldapparel.com right now. Also, just a reminder, we're on YouTube. Go to the Back Home Network channel on YouTube and click subscribe, and you can get our podcast delivered right to your inbox. If you've got the subscription and the email thing on there. If not, you can just go to YouTube and check out not just Crimson Cast, but all of the Back Home Network shows, Assembly Call, X's and Joe's, all the other shows in the stable. We would love to have you there. Over 7,500 people have subscribed on YouTube. We've also got a Substack. If you'd like to get the podcast delivered right to your email inbox, go to crimsoncast.substack.com, sign up. It's free, no strings attached. There is a paid option if you would like to financially support the podcast. No obligation, but $5 a month, $50 a year certainly helps us out with hosting fees and whatnot. So again, crimsoncast.substack.com. Please join us there or join us on YouTube or both. All right, let's dive in. We'll talk a little IU football first, and we'll move over to basketball as there hasn't been a flood of new news on basketball yet, but we do have a couple of things that we can bring to you. First off, let's talk about IU football. We saw Curt Cignetti come out and talk on, I guess this would have been Thursday, and he was not happy. If you go back and look at his comments, he was displeased with the lack of juice in practice on Thursday, the lack of effort. And it's funny, like you can always, if you followed Nick Saban's career or if you follow some of these other really successful football coaches, they always talk almost to the point where they get made fun of about, essentially taking every opportunity to get as good as you can on a day-by-day basis. It's very unusual for IU to have a coach that talks in that parlance, but that's what they've got in Curt Cignetti. And he came out and said, I think today, this was on Thursday, I think today we squandered an opportunity to improve as much as possible, probably not mentally prepared to come out and do what it takes to have a successful practice and improve as much as possible. There's many other situations we've seen in college sports. If you read about it at all, this is the kind of talk you want to see out of your coach, especially at this time of year where there's very little at stake, there's very little going on. But this is where a lot of the material improvements can start to happen in terms of execution, understanding the playbook, understanding how to work with each other. So I think for a lot of IU fans, if you haven't seen the clip from Cignetti, go seek it out. It brought a smile to my face. It's like, here we are in the middle of April, and you've got a coach that's trying to push the team forward to be better. And that's refreshing. I'm glad to see that that's occurring. There was an interesting set of interviews with the incoming running backs and, of course, Kalen Black, who stuck around from last year. And, Black was asked about how the running back room compares to last year and noted like he didn't see there being any kind of a drop off, that they brought in some really heavy hitters who are bringing it, as he put it, to every practice. And so you like to see that and hear that. As with everything, it's hard to necessarily take what you're hearing in these media availabilities and translate it into any kind of tangible expectation. At this point, everybody thinks they're going to be good. Every fan base and every team thinks they're going to be good going into next year in some way, shape, or form. I think for Indiana, what you want to see and what you want to hear is this idea that, hey, we got a long way to go to get to the level that we want to get to, and that last year is over. And as we wind our way through spring practice, getting ready for the spring game coming up on Thursday of this upcoming week, I think a lot of it for IU really just comes down to maintaining that mentality that there's a lot of work left to be done. And what are you doing to try to get yourself to the point where you can really compete at the level you need to? We'll obviously talk a lot more about schedule and roster and whatnot later on in the summer, but so much of this ends up coming down to this idea of what is the sense of urgency. There was a nice piece by Pete DePremio on IUHoosiers.com regarded, it really talked about like needing this sense of urgency in practice. There's just the win mantra from this team is, I think, going to be an interesting one to see how it translates out onto the field. This year is going to be a little different than last year. It almost felt like last year's team, you felt like they might have some potential, and then things started to roll for them, but they snuck up on some people in terms of, wow, is Indiana actually this good? Then you'd play them. It's like, oh, yeah, they are actually this good. So ultimately, as Cignetti pointed out in an earlier press availability, I don't see any glaring holes out there, he said. But he also said, like, do we have any groups that are ready to compete for the Super Bowl right now? I don't see that either. I see a work in progress like every team in America right now. So ultimately, you got to integrate the new pieces, and there's a lot of new pieces that are going to have to play well from the word go, as you do have a more challenging schedule in the way it's laid out than what you had last year. You've got that early game against Illinois. You've got those road games against Iowa and Oregon. You got that road game against Penn State later on. So, the one thing that is pretty clear overall is Cignetti is still grinding, and this team is starting to figure things out as far as what they are expected to be. And the idea that Cignetti goes in and has a bit of a blow up with them at a practice about a week before the spring game, clearly not accidental. And this is, there's a mentality there that's nice, but it's also to some degree the kind of thing you expect from coaches. If you've watched coaches enough, if things are going well, you have to create some adversity or some kind of a negative reaction, because you got to give your players something to play against as they're going through the practice and going through trying to figure out what they're supposed to be. Avoiding complacency, something that we hear about over and over again in sports. And certainly for a team like Indiana, going into last year, you don't have very much at all to be complacent about. This year, you could. I mean, you go to the college football playoff and you're celebrating the greatest season in team history in terms of regular season. A lot of it ends up getting to you in a negative way if you don't have something to point to say we have to get better off of that. And it's what we've heard out of this team and the coaching staff over the course of some of the availabilities this spring. This idea that, yeah, we had a great season, but 2 out of our last 3 games, we're not good. Like, we didn't play to anywhere close to our level, and we've got to fix that. We've seen some rankings of different players in the Big Ten that have popped up lately as we're starting to see some preliminary media for next year, as rosters are mostly set, not completely, as we'll talk about in a minute. But, Elijah Surratt, I think I saw him on a list the other day as like the second best returning receiver in the Big Ten. They're probably right. I mean, Surratt had a great season last season, 53 catches. And, but I think you're also sleeping on Omar Cooper at this point. And Omar Cooper Jr. with almost as many touchdowns last year as Surratt, wasn't targeted quite as much. You do really wonder, the more you learn about Curtis Rourke's injury, how much that might have affected his ability to equally target both sides of the field. And it's going to be fascinating with Mendoza under center, what Indiana's approach is with the wide receiver core. I don't expect Indiana to have the same approach offensively necessarily that they had last season, especially with the changeup in the offensive coaching personnel, with Chandler Whitmer coming in to replace Tino Sinceri as the co-OC and quarterbacks coach. How that affects the play calling and how that affects the way that Mike Shanahan decides to go about the offense is going to be really interesting. And then, of course, obviously, how effective can Indiana's offensive line be as they reconstitute themselves with some new personnel also. So we'll see what happens with the spring game. I did want to give everybody a little bit of a weather update as far as the spring game is concerned. Hopefully you're going to be able to make it down. Obviously, moving the game from Saturday to Thursday hurt in some ways, but probably helped in some other ways in terms of maybe you can't get down here on Easter weekend, which is what it was going to be, but you can get down here on a Thursday evening. I'll say if you're in Indianapolis and you can make it down, it's a pretty quick drive. You can get from Zionsville to Bloomington, like downtown Bloomington, in an hour now, thanks to the interstate. So if you haven't been back to Bloomington in a little bit, but you'd like to come down and check the game out on Thursday, it's not going to be that long, as they're only going to play, I think, a simulated half. But I would try to get down there and see what's going on with this team. It should be a lot of fun. I'm going to be there in some capacity. We'll see what happens with everything in terms of who's playing and what they end up doing. We also got to keep an eye on the weather, as it's going to be pretty wet that day. It's supposed to have rain probability throughout the day, although in the evening, it's not supposed to be raining. And it looks like, the rain probability drops pretty significantly. So hopefully we get at least a dry period during the game itself. But hopefully we'll see you down here for the spring game. Should be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to seeing this team back in uniform for the first time in what will essentially be 4 months since the last time we saw them up in South Bend. So it's nice because that ends up being kind of the marker, and you get past that marker and you realize we're only 4 months essentially at that point, a little over 4 months away from the start of the regular season. And that is certainly exciting, as we're really looking forward to seeing what IU football does in year 2 of the Curt Cignetti era. Let's go ahead and jump over to basketball on the Indiana side real quick. Not a whole lot of additional news from what we talked about before when we discussed all of this. Of course, I think it was after the last podcast I did. I was on a trip, so I'm a little bit behind, but they signed Reed Bailey, the 6'10 forward from Davidson. Reed Bailey, interesting film. You should go check this out if you haven't yet. Bailey averaged 18 points, almost 19 points, 6 rebounds, 4 assists in about 33 minutes a game at Davidson, and was an All-Atlantic 10 first-team selection. Really looks like an intriguing prospect. Definitely a guy who is not a banger in the paint, more a player that shifts and moves almost like a point forward in some ways in terms of the way he distributes the basketball, at least in the way Davidson was using him. And if you've watched enough film of what DeVries has liked to do offensively, you can see him fitting in potentially in terms of how Indiana would want to go about running their offense. Not entirely certain on the defensive front, as Bailey certainly not the most physically imposing of individuals, and averaged less than 1 block shot a game. So obviously just one piece in part of a larger puzzle that Indiana is trying to put together, but a nice piece to have. And certainly I think a piece that's going to slide in well to this particular system. So you look at Reed Bailey, you've added him now to a roster that has Tucker DeVries, who, it's funny, for a lot of people, they are looking at what Indiana's done so far in the portal and underwhelmed because of the lack of numbers. And I've heard a lot where are the top level players? And I think we forget Tucker DeVries, one of the best shooters in the portal, came here. And yes, he's here because his dad's here, but that's still a very nice pickup for Indiana. Connor Enright, the guard from DePaul, also in the mix. And then a bunch of players that Indiana's still waiting on. And I know some people still getting nervous. We talked about this about 9 days ago. I would just say pump the brakes a little bit. We've still got plenty of time. A lot of the signings that we're seeing last year that were really good didn't happen until later on in April. And with the House settlement not having been finalized, the rush, again, as I said last week, the rush that a lot of people thought there might be to get these deals signed has lessened, because it does not appear we are in imminent danger of getting a final ruling on that settlement. And even if we did, I don't even know when it would necessarily take effect. So a lot of what you're seeing right now, I think, is players evaluating what their possibilities are, shopping themselves around. We've seen a couple of instances already now where players have backed out or have utilized the recruitment by one group of teams as a way to get recruited by another group of teams in the portal. Indiana's out there essentially kind of swimming in the same waters that everybody else is at this point. And the roster, I think, is slowly building. There's some visits on campus this weekend, and a lot of it now just comes down to, is there a fit, a mutual fit between the two parties? Can you close? Can you get the types of players that you want, knowing that, well, hey, if you don't land a particular player, there are many other players out there that not just fit the statistical profile, but also fit the personality profile that you're looking for if you're Darren DeVries. So you'll see names pop up, and this is, as I think I talked about a couple of weeks ago, this is a great time to not be on social media and not be on the message boards, because what we're seeing over and over again is a name will get mentioned, everybody rushes to watch film, you fall in love with that player, and then the player goes somewhere else. And it really just underlines a core tenet of the portal, which is that you don't know. And a lot of times the names that are getting mentioned, these are leaks that are coming from managers or, assistant coaches that have relationships with journalists or agents. A lot of times it's agents, because they're trying to drum up interest in their player. So these are almost always rumors that are not attached to anything concrete. They're half information, or they're not necessarily fully something that you can count on. But the problem is, the average fan online gets really attached because they think, oh, this player is going to come to IU, or this player is going to come to whatever institution, and then they don't, and you get upset, because you've now invested yourself in some way, shape, or form in that player being there, even though there was no assurance necessarily that that player was coming. Even in the Trilly Donovan, message boards of the world, where you'll get these very definitive statements like, this player is going to this school, the hit rate on those is not what you would think that it is. And one of the issues that you run into right now is that for a lot of players, this is still open season in terms of figuring out what their actual market value is. Teams are also trying to discover that as well. And teams are trying to balance a certain degree of salary cap management, for lack of a better term, with the idea of, hey, we're going to go get this particular player. And again, what I would warn people on is you've got to be cautious about what you are guessing a player is worth, or how good a player may necessarily be or not be. As we've seen over the course of the last couple of years, you've had some players that have transferred from big program to big program that everybody got excited about, and they ended up not necessarily panning out for the majority of the season. Maybe they would pan out late, but maybe not pan out at all. We've also seen players that were only marginally regarded because they came from smaller schools. I saw a thread on one of the message boards for IU where someone was lamenting the list of players that Indiana looked like they were in for. And there was some kind of comment like, that IU is going to really regret having hired this coach, because clearly they're not in for very many top-level players or top-level athletes. And yet, when you go around and you look at a lot of the really top-level players for many of the top-level teams that transferred in, a lot of them came from smaller schools. And we've talked about several of them on the show. So, it's a mistake to automatically assume that you know how good a player is going to be, or what type of player Indiana is even looking for in the first place. So, again, I'd counsel some patience. There was some news from this past week about Indiana making some moves finally on the coaching staff front. There was an announcement that, well, it wasn't an official announcement yet, but that Kenny Johnson is coming back. That's an interesting one. Kenny Johnson, of course, was on the IU staff for many years under Tom Crean, and then ended up at Louisville, was kind of part of that whole scandal down there, and then was actually at Rhode Island and then Georgetown over the course of the last few years. There was a lot of initial consternation from certain circles about the Kenny Johnson signing, and yet when I look at it, I mean, I got an email from a couple of folks like, "Wow, Indiana, must be really willing to go in on the deep end in terms of signing coaches who have gotten in trouble with the NCAA before." And look, I would caution people in terms of thinking that way for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Louisville situation with Kenny Johnson, what I would look at there is all of the things that Johnson ended up getting taken out on that job for are things that I would caution you to read too much into in terms of the current rules landscape of the NCAA. And, ultimately, I think it's interesting that IU and Darren DeVries looked at this particular potential hire and said, this is a guy that we want. Johnson opens up a lot of doors, obviously, in terms of the DMV, the DC area, basically, in terms of recruiting, where Indiana's gotten some excellent players in the past. It's interesting. I find with IU fans that once a coach leaves, rarely is there a situation where people are really excited to see that person come back. There are a couple of exceptions to that, obviously, but with the Kenny Johnson news, at the end of it all, like the majority of the things that IU fans would have looked negatively at with Johnson are now not impermissible by NCAA rules. So you're in a different era at this point. And ultimately, as you have to go out and get players, I saw somebody say, like, why would you bring a guy in whose primary staple is recruiting when recruiting isn't that important? Recruiting is still incredibly important. Like I'm fascinated by the mentality that somehow recruiting is not an important part of college basketball now. Because as we've talked about on the show many times, there is a real need to build relationships. And that's really what recruiting is all about. When you think about the way that IU has gone about this in the past, and you look at the last 8 years of recruiting, it's been a pretty uninspiring approach from IU in terms of the way that they have built and sustained relationships. We saw throughout the Archie Miller era and throughout the Mike Woodson era that IU really struggled in this category. And so I'm really fascinated to see what ends up happening here with Kenny Johnson, and whether he can rebuild some of the old relationships that he had and how that plays in to what Darren DeVries' overall mission is. We have heard quite a bit about the idea that this is going to be a large staff. And so Kenny Johnson is one member of that larger staff, I think could only be an asset to Indiana in terms of what they want to do in terms of talent acquisition. I'll also note this, Bob Knight, of all people, used to regularly bring in former head coaches or not so much former assistant coaches, but former head coaches who were damaged goods, and they would rehabilitate in his system. Nick Saban, as you'll note, often does the same thing with Alabama. And, a lot of it really is, what is the environment that Indiana is able to provide? And when you think about the war chest Indiana's got with NIL, when you think about all these other factors that Indiana will have in the mix, and you think about the fact that as we move forward, Indiana is going to be in a position where they can take advantage of a larger than average amount of money in an era where you have to have people who know how to build relationships and know how to get people to come to your institution to play basketball. You want coaches with Kenny Johnson's resume on your staff. So I understand some trepidation from certain IU fans, but this is one of those hires I think that makes a lot of sense, and I'm curious how they fill out the rest of the staff. Another new hire for Indiana is Mike Bargin. I'll be honest, I haven't figured out exactly how to pronounce the name yet, but coached at Bradley in the Missouri Valley as associate head coach and offensive coordinator, and was a coach that this is an off-the-court role that he's been hired at. That's according to the Indy Star. Coached with Darren DeVries before. They both worked together at Creighton under Dana Altman. So this is another coach that IU head coach Darren DeVries has some past history with. So it'll be interesting to see how he integrates and what this off the court role looks like. I'm always fascinated with what exactly these roles are going to look like overall and how they all play out. But I think for Indiana, the idea they're building a large staff and they're going to have both recruitment and player development is a good thing, obviously. And look, Mike Woodson had the same thing. So this group now includes those two coaches alongside Nick Norton, who came with DeVries from West Virginia, and Drew Adams, who came from Cincinnati. So it'll be interesting to see if anybody else gets added to the mix. And even though there hasn't been an official announcement on this, I expect we're pretty close to what Indiana is going to end up with as far as their total setup of coaches. And that can only help on the recruitment front. I don't think it's any coincidence that right before these recruits that are coming in this weekend to visit IU's campus, you've got this kind of unofficial announcement that you've got two assistant coaches that are now completely in the fold. So things are coming together for IU. And as we look around the college landscape, you're still seeing guys hop into the portal. I think there's another 12 days left for where players can enter the portal. So a lot of things that are going to be really fascinating to watch here, I think, over the next week or two as Indiana starts to round their roster into shape now that they have the coaching staff, it looks like, mostly squared away. Indiana's tried with some other assistant coaches as well. Unofficially, we heard there was a lot of back and forth over an assistant at one institution that had coached with Darren DeVries before. It looked like that coach was going to come to IU, and then their school offered them a bunch of money, and they ended up sticking around. And I think you're going to see a lot of this within the confines of the college basketball landscape as everybody tries to figure out what is it that we need to do to sustain success. I think a lot of schools that have the financial backing are just like, well, we need to spend money. And we'd rather keep a really good staff member in place. Obviously, if a guy's going to go be a head coach somewhere, you're probably not going to stop him from being able to do that. We talked about that a bunch in football with Kalen DeBoer. Like, there were people that were arguing, like, well, why didn't IU offer him more money to stay rather than him taking the Fresno State job? And it's like, there's a huge difference between, hey, someone wants to hire me as an assistant somewhere else versus, hey, someone wants to hire me as a head coach and I get all that increased responsibility and prestige. So it's not a foregone conclusion, as it might have been in the past, that if Indiana or Kentucky or Kansas or whomever comes calling, that you're going to leave your role and go be an assistant coach somewhere else, especially if your institution that you're currently at is like, hey, we'll pay you whatever they're going to pay you, maybe even more, to stay here. And at that point, if you're Indiana or Kentucky or Kansas or whomever, you've got to think, well, how much do we really want to spend on this person? And are there similarly good options elsewhere? And so, much like the player situation that Indiana runs into sometimes, it might be that you could spend the money on the player, but is it worth it after a certain threshold? And we've seen that in some of the things that are going on in college sports movement right now with players, where there was a recent announcement about a new signing, or I don't even know if signing is the right word necessarily, but there was a note that what was the name of the player? Rob Wright, who had been at Baylor, is signing at BYU. And there were other schools interested in Rob Wright, but he's reportedly signing at BYU for $3.5 million for this upcoming year, which is nuts. But that's the landscape you find yourself in. If you've got a school that's willing to open up the pocketbook and go out and pay a lot of money for particular players, they may not be like, no, I don't want the extra money. I'd like to go to this one school. At this point, I think for most of these players, yes, you'd like to play on a highly competitive team, but you're oftentimes going to a school, if they've got a bunch of money, that can be competitive and will be competitive. So why not just go ahead and do that, as opposed to, I'm going to take less money to go to a supposedly more prestigious school? I mean, you look at what happened in the Elite Eight this year or the Sweet 16 and some of the teams that were there. I mean, the idea that Houston, which 10 years ago was not a major player really in college basketball at all, they were an afterthought, like barely could get people to their games on campus. They accrued enough talent over the course of time and recruited smartly and now have the NIL money available that they became a destination just by steadily improving over time. And this is where it's almost like the new world order of college sports, in as much as you've got to take into account this idea that it is not a requirement that you go to one of the very top teams in college basketball in order to be able to compete for a national title or the latter stages of a tournament. And I can't kind of overstate this enough. Indiana does not have a lot of built-in market advantages right now. Brand new coach, not a lot of players on the roster. And for a lot of players, they're looking at the landscape and they're saying, well, why accept less money to be part of one of those organizations if I've got a smaller organization, smaller school that's willing to pay me as much or more, where I might shine a bit more and have more opportunities? And again, like you go back 4 or 5 years, Florida, not in particularly good shape from a record perspective. You look at a school like Tennessee. That's a school that missed the tournament 3 years in a row between 2015 and 2017 and was going to miss the tournament probably in 2020. And yet they've built their roster into something where it's a destination location. And they were able to pull a guy like Dalton Connect a couple of years ago, or they were able to, pull, some of the other players that have been out there. Who was it? Chaz Lanier, I think, who played at North Florida for 4 years, comes in and chose Tennessee and ended up being one of the best players in the country. Auburn fits into that same category. Alabama from like 6 or 7 years ago fits into that category. Texas Tech fits into that category. They had that big dip post Chris Beard, and they've shot right back up again. So my point is just simply, a lot of it comes down to resource management. And this is where, if you're in Indiana, you want to get the best possible assemblage of talent, but you don't want to significantly overpay, even if you've got more money than everybody else, unless you feel like it's going to give you such a competitive advantage that you have to have that player. And I've yet to see people that IU's been in for where it's like, if we don't get that player, we simply can't compete. There's no other player like them in the portal. Like, that's where I think for Indiana, you look around, and this is where people have got to remember, there are a huge number of college basketball programs. There's a lot of really good players. Some of those players are playing at a level or two below, in terms of school level, where their talent level is actually at. And so that's what excites me about some of the names that have been on Indiana's list, even if they're from smaller schools. At this point, again, and I'll keep saying this, like, you got to trust the talent evaluation that Darren DeVries and his staff are going through with some of these players, much as we did with football last year, when Indiana brought a bunch of JMU players in, some other players from some smaller FBS schools, a couple of FCS players. If you looked at it and you said, well, those players can't compete at the highest level, well, you were wrong, because they did. So you do have to some degree, check a little bit of what you know about plugging talent in and where talent comes from at the door in this process. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's 100% going to work, but I don't think that you can go into the process assuming that it's not going to work. It's also just, it's crazy out there right now. For those of you who didn't see the news this morning, Tennessee announced that they're moving on from their starting quarterback, Nico Iamaleava, or however you pronounce his last name. I'm doing my Scott impression this morning. But they announced that after he did not attend practice amid NIL contract discussions, that they're like, sorry, we're done. You can assume perhaps he made an ultimatum on an NIL number, and they said, no thanks, we'll move on. But this is the domino effect at work, because if they're actually moving on, and we'll see, maybe there'll be some kind of reconciliation here. This might be Tennessee's ultimatum right back. Teams that are desperately looking for a starting quarterback, well, there's one in the portal right now. So now who's going to be willing to pay? So again, whether you're talking about basketball or whether you're talking about football, it's not simply a matter of, we're going to go get players. There are other players that you can probably get that may not cost you as much money. And it does matter how much money you're spending on those players in terms of a collective. I'm very fascinated to see how this plays out. We're going to talk a lot more once we get that house finalized, the house settlement finalized, just talk through what some of the implications of that are going to be and how it ends up playing out. So we'll continue to update you over the course of the next couple of weeks with IU basketball news, roster additions, whatnot. Emergency pods generally go over to Assembly Call for those, but we'll try to give you some updated analysis as we find out more about the different folks coming in to play basketball for Indiana. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Thanks for joining me. Relatively short show, but we'll be back with more coming up soon. For the Back Home Network and for Crimson Cast, I'm Galen Clavia. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Thanks to our presenting sponsor, Home Field Apparel. Stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.